Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the real question is whether or not you can give impetus to the deployment of broadband and what role the federal government plays. And I'm impressed with, Mr. Mefford, what's happening, with Connected Nation and Kentucky, and Maine has a Connect Maine initiative. But they've undertaken it because there is, a huge vacuum in leadership, even at the national level. I mean, these are measures undertaken by, governments that otherwise cannot afford to do it, but, issuing, government obligation bonds and so on in order to do this because they recognize it as an economic imperative, especially in rural America. I mean, that's the real issue here. I mean, how are we going to rebuild rural America at a time in which we're dramatically losing, and the acceleration of loss, I might add, of manufacturing jobs. In our state, we've lost 17% of manufacturing jobs since 2000. It keeps happening. It happened recently. We lost major companies in rural America. How do you rebuild it? You rebuild it by giving them access to the technology so that they can, conduct their small enterprises in these rural economies, whether or not irrespective of where you live, that you don't have to be in urban America. I mean, I think that's one of the real issues I think that we have to confront in this country today is what we're going to do to assist small towns to rebuild their economies, and this is one dimension of that. And I don't know, Mr. Mefford, maybe you can, add to this debate about whether or not, at least at what pace would you expect what has occurred in Kentucky with Connected Nation could be applied nationally. I mean, I think that's the real issue. I mean, the President set a goal in 2004 that by the end of 2007 we would have, broadband deployment. That hasn't happened, obviously. So what would it take to apply, your model across this nation? I mean, how long would it take?
Well, first of all, it requires something like S1492 or Senator Durbin's Connect the Nation Act. That is what enables states, that will empower states to replicate this model.
Yeah, you need the broadband mapping.
Well, that's the starting point. Somebody said, the mapping is sort of like putting on your clothes to go to work. I mean, that's what gets us started. That's what starts this market-based approach that embraces all providers. When I say market-based, I mean that it's this dual focus on both supply and demand, but it is inclusive of all types of providers. And so in Kentucky, when I say we've gone from 60% to 95%, that includes cable and DSL and fixed wireless and municipal wireless and municipal cable, all these different types of services. So to answer your question, once that empowering piece of legislation is passed, then the process can begin immediately. We're engaged with about a dozen different states on different levels, so the interest is there, and we certainly have the capacity to engage additional states. But once the funding is in place, that certainly, like most things, is the largest impediment.
Mm-hmm. Would that be enough? How long would it take to, once that was done, once it concluded, how long would it take to have that ripple effect across America to adopt the model?
It would be, we're talking a matter of months. I mean, if we can establish a single clearinghouse where that data is placed, then it's it's processing data and distributing that throughout the country.
I see a consistency, frankly, in general, just with the Telecommunications Act of 1934. I mean, we thought it was in national interest to extend telephone to all parts of America. That's why Senator Rockefeller and I created the E-rate program.
Senator Snowe, I would say that point just provides more additional merit for this approach to empower states. I mean, I think where states have been active in engaging providers in the context of telecommunications reform, I think we have seen some positive results. Certainly, and obviously, it hasn't been complete and total, or we wouldn't be here today. But again, as we have employed this market-based approach in the states that we're engaged with, and I'll reference Kentucky specifically, we've seen that increase, and that has been primarily by private sector providers. Not totally, but that investment has been made in large part by private sector providers. In the remaining 5% that we have to cover, Kentucky will be at 100% broadband coverage by the end of this year. That has required a more entrepreneurial approach, and so that does get us to the point where we have to look at things like public-private partnerships that incent investment. And so we may have local governments partnering with private sector providers to build out infrastructure and sharing revenue. But that, again, has been the minority part of our approach.
But there would be a public commitment. Is there a public commitment currently on the Connect Kentucky, for example? I mean, does
yes, ma'am.
Local government participate financially?
They do. The largest commitment comes from the state. And so generally in our states, about 80% of the commitment comes from state government, and the remaining 20% comes from the private sector. And not just telecommunications providers, but companies in general that have a vested interest in the growth of technology. So we have healthcare companies and automobile companies and banks and so forth.
And Mr. Mefford, you have the last word.
Senator Snowe, thank you again for the invitation today. I would just end by reiterating the fact that America's broadband challenge is as much about demand as it is supply in my mind, and I think Senator Kerry has affirmed this today, affirmed it yesterday in his blog post, to note that we have to acknowledge that the number of people actually using the technology that has already been deployed is extremely low from the household standpoint. And what our model and the data that we've generated after the fact has revealed is that as we can increase those numbers of people actually subscribing to broadband, then providers are obviously more interested in deploying further and further and further out into those developing markets. And in the things that can be done at the very grassroots level are basic in nature, but it is about generating awareness and helping households and small businesses understand and appreciate better the value of broadband. And so we've recently released some data or gathered some data where we say, what are the factors that caused you to become a new subscriber to broadband? The top reasons are things like, well, I realized that broadband was worth the extra money. Then I learned that broadband became available in my area. So you can see these are awareness building issues. Then the third is I got a computer in my home. And so we know that's an obstacle that we have to address. On down the list is the point that, well, I decided that broadband became affordable. So contrary to some conventional wisdom that's out there, our biggest challenge to adoption is not price. It is in raising awareness and improving the value proposition that allows individuals, families, and businesses to make the decision to spend the money on broadband.
But you wouldn't disagree that price is a barrier?
Price is absolutely a barrier for some segments of the population.
Because they only depend on one provider, for example, in many locations.
That's right, but Senator, what we've seen in Kentucky is that by effectively, what we do in effect is lower the cost of entry for new providers or for existing providers to extend their networks. As that has happened, we've seen that now the majority of Kentuckians have a choice between at least two providers. Many have a choice between 3 and 4 and 5 providers. And as that has happened, we've seen the effects of competition and prices have come down. And far and away, price is not the top reason given that people aren't investing in broadband. But absolutely, to your point, we are focused on addressing price, and we don't consider a broadband solution an option worthy of mapping until it is affordable. And to the point of computers being an obstacle, we have developed programs, again, that are state-specific. One that we call No Child Left Offline that actually uses donations from companies like Microsoft and Lexmark and CA and Intel, and we put computers in the homes of identified families, underprivileged families, and that addresses that barrier of computer ownership and allows them then to become a broadband subscriber.
Okay, well, I appreciate it. Well, thank you all very much. It's been very helpful and very critical to this issue, and I thank you for your excellent testimony.